The wind carried the smell of scorched grass and dry earth across the Kansas plain, and Clara Whitfield knelt at the edge of a sunflower patch gone brittle with drought, breaking the dead heads open with her thumbnail to see if any seed remained inside. Most were empty husks. She cracked a third, then a fourth, and found a small handful of pale kernels, bitter and small, but food all the same. She was 24 years old and 3 weeks a widow, and she had learned more about hunger in those 3 weeks than in all the years before them combined. Her husband Thomas had been dead 3 weeks, thrown from a Greenbrook gelding he had no business riding, and the small farm they'd scraped together outside of Larned had gone with him into the ground, sold out from under her within a fortnight by his brother, who held the paper on it and no love for her at all. She had left with a trunk she could carry herself, a small purse of coins that would not last the month, and a grief that sat in her like a stone she'd swallowed whole and could not bring back up. She had walked 2 days along the wagon road that cut west out of town, sleeping the first night in the lee of a hayrick, the second beneath a bridge where the creek had gone to mud. Her shoes had given out at the seams. Her hands were raw. She told herself she was looking for work, though she had no clear notion of what work a woman alone might find in this country, and she was too proud to beg and too hungry not to eat weeds, if weeds were what there was. The sound came before the sight of it, a steady drum of hooves and the creak of a wagon axle, moving unhurried down the same rutted track she knelt beside. She did not look up right away. She told herself she was only resting, only tending to a torn hem, anything but a woman caught picking through dead flowers for something to chew on. But the wagon slowed, and then it stopped, and the silence that followed was thick enough that she had no choice but to lift her head. The man on the wagon seat was younger than she'd expected from the sound of him, 30 perhaps, with a jaw shadowed by several days without a razor, and eyes the pale gray of a sky before snow. He wore no hat, which struck her as strange for a rancher, until she saw the hat itself sitting upside down on the seat beside him, half full of wild plums he'd apparently been gathering along the road, same as she had been gathering seed. He looked at her, then at the sunflower husks scattered at her knees, and something in his face did not change exactly, but settled, the way a man's face settles when he has already decided something and is only waiting to say it out loud. "Those won't feed a person long," he said. His voice carried no pity in it, which she was grateful for, because pity was a thing she did not think she could bear just then. "I wasn't looking to be fed long," she said. "Just fed today." He considered this. He looked out at the land behind him, where she could now see the shape of a house and a low string of outbuildings a half-mile off, smoke rising thin from a chimney. Then he looked back at her and asked the question plainly, the way a man asks after the weather. "Can you keep a kitchen for 18 men?" Clara blinked. She had steadied herself for an insult, or an order to move along, or the kind of offer a woman alone on a road learns to be afraid of. This was none of those things. It was a plain question, asked by a man who seemed to want a plain answer, and something in her chest that had been clenched tight for 3 weeks loosened, just slightly, just enough to let her breathe. "I kept a kitchen for a husband and 4 hired hands for 6 years, she said. 18 is only a bigger pot." He nodded once, as though that settled a matter he'd been turning over for some time. "Name's Silas Cross," he said. "Board and $6 a month, through the spring branding. Room's small, but it's dry." He did not offer his hand. He simply reached down and moved the plums to make room on the wagon seat. And that was the whole of it. No further questions about where she'd come from or what had become of her. She climbed up beside him, and he clicked his tongue to the team, and the wagon rolled on toward the smoke rising in the distance. The Cross Ranch, when they reached it, was a hard, practical place, built for weather and work rather than comfort. Silas showed her to the kitchen without preamble, and Clara saw at once that it had been a long while since a woman's hand had touched it. A crust of old grease clung to the stovetop. Flour sat open to the air in a barrel by the door, weevilled through. A stack of tin plates leaned against the wall, unwashed, and the whole room carried the sour smell of a place used hard and cared for very little. "There's a well out back," Silas said, watching her take it in. seeming to brace for her to turn around and walk back out the door the way she'd come in. "I'll need lye, soap, and rags, and every bucket you own," Clara said instead, already rolling her sleeves. "Yes, ma'am," he said, and went to fetch them without another word, and did not come back to check on her progress or offer instruction, which told her more about the sort of man he was than any speech could have. He recognized competence when he saw it, and he had the good sense to get out of its way. She did not cook for 18 that first evening. She scrubbed until her knuckles bled, and when the light went gold and low through the one window, she found a heel of salt pork and some withered carrots, and made herself a thin stew and ate it sitting at the table she had just scoured clean. And it was the first food in 3 weeks that had tasted like anything other than survival. When Silas came in from the barn, he stopped in the doorway the way a man stops when he walks into a room he no longer recognizes. The stove gleamed. The floor had been swept to bare boards. The air smelled of soap and pork fat rather than rot. He did not say anything about it. He only sat when she set a plate in front of him and ate every bite, and carried his own plate to the wash basin after, which she understood to be his particular way of saying thank you. "The branding crew rides in Thursday," he told her. 18 men, 3 days running. "I'll need the wagon for town first," she said. "Flour, coffee, dried apples if the mercantile has them. Take Amos with you at first light," he said. And that was the whole conversation, brief and practical, the way she would come to learn all his conversations were. The days that followed fell into a rhythm that asked everything of her, and gave her, in return, something she had not expected to feel again so soon: purpose. She rose before the sun, and had coffee boiling and biscuits in the oven before the first man stumbled in from the bunkhouse. The hands were a rough, weathered lot, wary of her at first, used to burnt bacon and their own poor coffee, watching her with the careful suspicion men give to anything new and unproven. She won them the way she'd won every skeptical man she'd ever fed, with food too good to complain about. Her first supper for the full crew was a beef and dumpling stew thick enough to stand a spoon in, with a pan of cornbread and a crock of apple butter she'd put up herself from the wild plums Silas had been gathering. The men ate like they hadn't eaten in a week, and the bunkhouse that night was quieter than usual, satisfied in the particular way that only a full belly provides. Silas watched all of it with the same steady, unhurried attention he seemed to give everything. He noticed the way the men wiped their boots before coming inside now, where before they'd tracked mud without a thought. He noticed the way the house, which had felt like a shell he merely occupied, had begun to feel occupied in some truer sense. He found himself, more than once, simply watching her hands as she worked dough, or watching the small line of concentration between her brows as she checked a pot, and telling himself it was only a rancher's satisfaction at a job well done, though he was beginning to suspect it was something more, and being a slow man in matters of the heart, he did not yet know what to do with the suspicion. He began doing small things without remark. He fixed the sag in the porch step she used a dozen times a day. He oiled the hinge on the pantry door that had squealed since before she arrived. One evening, he left a burlap sack of wild plums on the kitchen table and said only, "I thought you might want these for another crock." She said nothing in return, but the next day there was a plum cobbler waiting on the warming shelf when he came in from the fields, and when he tasted it, he had to look away from her for a moment, because it tasted like a kind of comfort he had told himself he no longer had any right to expect. Their conversation stayed brief and practical, circling supplies and weather and the number of mouths to feed. But underneath the plain words, something else had begun to grow, quiet and unacknowledged, the way a seed takes root before anything shows above the soil. They were two people who recognized competence in each other and had begun, without naming it, to build something out of that recognition. The branding work ran hard through the following weeks, long days of dust and bawling calves and men coming in each evening bone-tired, but the sight of lamplight in the kitchen window and the smell of supper on the stove was enough to carry them the last mile home. Clara had become, without meaning to, the center the whole outfit turned around. One night Silas came in well past the others, having stayed out to doctor a heifer that had torn herself on wire. The bunkhouse was dark and quiet. He found Clara still at the kitchen table, mending a shirt by lamplight, a plate covered with a cloth waiting on the stove for him. "You didn't need to wait up," he said, his voice rough with the day's work. "A man ought to have something hot when he comes in," she said, not looking up from her needle. He sat and ate in the quiet, the only sounds the tick of the clock and the whisper of thread through fabric. And he thought, watching her, that he had lived 5 years alone since the fever took his first wife, and that he had called it living, when in truth it had only been enduring. This kitchen, this woman bent over her mending in the lamplight, felt like something he had stopped believing he was allowed to want again. The trouble arrived on a gray afternoon in early October, in the shape of a black buggy far too polished for the rutted road it had come down. A man in a city coat and a bowler hat stepped down from it with the brisk self-importance of someone accustomed to being deferred to. Silas met him on the porch, his face giving nothing away. "Mr. Cross," the man said, though he clearly already knew the name. "Whitmore, of the Dodge City Cattlemen's Trust. I believe you're expecting me." Silas was not expecting him, not exactly, though he had a bad feeling settle into his stomach as he waved the man inside. Clara, shelling peas at the kitchen counter, heard the name and went still, her hands pausing over the bowl. She knew what men from trusts and banks generally brought with them, and it was rarely good news. They sat at the long table, the same table the hands ate their meals at, and Whitmore laid out a set of papers with the smooth confidence of a man who had done this many times before and expected no resistance. "It concerns the note you took last spring, Cross," Whitmore said, "against this year's herd, for the new bull stock. It comes due at month's end." "I'm aware of the terms," Silas said, flat. "The difficulty," Whitmore went on, leaning forward slightly, "is that beef prices have softened. Word from the Kansas City yards is they'll soften further before the season's out. The trust finds itself somewhat exposed, given the size of your note against a falling market." It was, Clara understood at once, listening from the doorway with a dish rag still in her hands, a squeeze, plain and deliberate. Silas had counted on the fall drive to cover the note. If the market dropped enough, he would come up short, and Whitmore knew it, and had likely known it before he ever climbed into his buggy that morning. "I'm sure you're a capable rancher," Whitmore said, with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "But the arithmetic of markets is a different trade altogether from the arithmetic of cattle. The trust is prepared to purchase your note at a discount, taking the land as security. It would spare you the unpleasantness of a formal default." It was theft wearing the clothes of a kindness, and Silas's jaw tightened as he understood it fully, his hands going still and hard on the table's edge. He had built this place up from nothing after his first wife died, had held it together through years he did not care to remember. And now, a man with a ledger and a fine coat meant to take it from him with a stroke of a pen. He was on the verge of telling Whitmore to get off his land and take his chances when a new voice entered the room. Clara came in from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her face composed and clear. She did not glance at Silas for leave to speak. She walked straight to the small writing desk, where he kept his ledgers, and opened the largest one, running her finger down the columns of figures written there. "This is a private matter, ma'am," Whitmore said, sharp with irritation. Clara did not look up. "You counted 510 head fit for the fall drive," she said, her voice even, cutting cleanly through the tension in the room. "That's right," Silas said slowly, watching her with a flicker of surprise he did not try to hide. He had learned these past weeks to trust whatever she was building toward. "But you held back the 14 calves from the north draw," she went on. "The ones born late, too small in the spring to travel with the main herd." Silas frowned. "They wouldn't have brought a fair price. Not big enough." "Not then," Clara agreed. "But for the last 2 months, those 14 have had every scrap from this kitchen, the whey from the churning, the spoiled milk, every peeling and crust I couldn't use elsewhere. I've been feeding them out of the slop bucket morning and night, and I walked out to the north pasture myself this week to look at them. They are not small calves any longer." A silence settled over the table. Whitmore's confident smile had begun to falter. Silas stared at Clara, understanding dawning slowly across his weathered features. He had seen her carrying buckets out past the barn for weeks and assumed it only chicken feed, had not thought to ask further, and now understood he had been wrong to assume anything about the limits of her attention. Clara turned a page, took up a pencil, and began to write. Current price in Dodge, before this drop you're so concerned about, is $38 a head for prime stock. These 14 will grade prime. That's $532. Your note is for $500. If one of the hands drives them to the rail siding tomorrow, they can be loaded and in Dodge within 3 days. She slid the ledger across the table toward him. You'll have your money, Mr. Whitmore, with $32 left over for our trouble. Whitmore stared at the figures, then at Clara, his face shifting from disbelief to something closer to fury. He had ridden out expecting a struggling rancher he could pressure into a bad bargain, not a woman who understood a column of numbers as well as she understood a stove. He had been outmaneuvered, and not by the man whose name was on the note. He gathered his papers with stiff, angry motions. The trust will expect payment on schedule, cross, he said, his professional courtesy gone entirely. You'll have it, Silas said, calm now, rising to his full height, a solid and unhurried presence that required no raised voice to make its point. He held the man's gaze until Whitmore looked away first, then watched him stalk out to his buggy and drive off down the rutted road far faster than he'd come in on it. In the kitchen doorway, one of the hands let out a low whistle, and a quiet murmur of approval passed among the men who had gathered to listen. Silas did not look at any of them. He looked only at Clara, who stood by the table with her hands folded, composed as ever, as though she had not just single-handedly turned back a man from the cattleman's trust with nothing more than kitchen scraps and a clear head for figures. He wanted to say something to her, and found, for a long moment, that he did not have the words for the size of what he was feeling. He was seeing her, he realized, not as the woman he had hired off a dusty road to cook for his crew, but as something closer to a partner, someone who stood beside a man rather than behind him. That night, Silas did not sleep. He lay listening to the wind rising outside, turning the day's events over in his mind, Whitmore's smug certainty giving way to Clara's calm, irrefutable arithmetic. He had been drifting, he understood now, ever since his first wife's death, running the ranch on habit and grim endurance rather than any real hope for what it might become. He had been surviving. He had not, in any true sense, been living. Clara had arrived like rain after a long drought, and it was not only the house that had come back to life because of her. He rose before dawn to find the first snow of the season had fallen silent and thick in the night, laying a clean white blanket over the hard, dry land, making it new. He found Clara on the back porch, wrapped in a shawl, a cup of coffee warming her hands, watching the snow come down with a serene stillness in her face. It came early this year, she said softly, her breath showing pale in the cold air. It does, some years, he answered, and came to stand beside her. He was quiet a moment longer, and then he understood that the time for his usual quiet had passed. He had nearly lost everything the day before because he had let himself drift, and he would not make that particular mistake again, not with the one thing that mattered most. I'm not a man of many words, Clara. He began, his voice steady despite the nerves plain underneath it. I tend to see what's right in front of me, the fences and the herd, and I miss the larger things until they're near gone. Yesterday you saved this ranch, but you've been saving it since the morning I found you on that road. This house was only a building before you came. You've made it something else. He drew a breath, gathering himself for what came next. The branding crew will be paid off within the week. Your season's work is done, by the terms I hired you under, but I find I'm not prepared to see you go. I'd like you to stay through the winter and beyond. Not as my cook, Clara, as my wife. The porch held nothing but the hiss of falling snow for a long moment. Clara's expression did not change all at once, but a warmth rose slowly into her eyes, chasing off whatever shadow had lingered there since the road outside larned. She took a slow sip of her coffee, considering him with the same calm deliberation she gave to a pot that needed watching, and then let a small smile touch her mouth. I was wondering when you'd find your way to asking, she said. You're a good man, Silas Cross. Just a slow one. The relief that moved through him was strong enough to nearly buckle his knees, and a grin broke across his face, unlike any she had seen from him before, younger and lighter for it. "I expect I am," he admitted. Their courtship afterward was as plain and solid as the two of them, built of shared chores rather than flowery talk. They rode the fence lines together in the evenings, Clara handling her horse with an easy competence that surprised none of the hands who had come to respect her. She taught him to make a proper pie crust. He taught her to read an approaching storm by the color along the western sky. They were married within the month, on a Saturday, by the circuit judge who passed through Larned twice a year, Clara in a dress of blue calico she had sewn herself, Silas in his one good suit brushed clean for the occasion. The hands stood as witnesses, hats in their hands, faces scrubbed pink for the day, and afterward there was a wedding supper Clara had, of course, cooked herself, roast beef and potatoes and pies enough for the whole outfit twice over. That night, with the last of the men gone back to the bunkhouse and the snow gleaming blue-white under a sky thick with stars, Silas took Clara's hand on the porch. "Welcome home," he said. "I've been home a while now," she answered. 5 years on, the light lay long and gold across the Kansas plain, painting the grass the color of old brass. Silas sat on the porch swing he'd built the second spring of their marriage, its familiar creak keeping time with the evening quiet. The ranch had grown steady and sound in those years. Fences mended, herds fattened. The house behind him full of the good noise of a life well lived. Clara came out and settled beside him, handing him his coffee, moving with the same unhurried grace she always had, though the strain that had once lined her face on that first dusty road was long gone now, replaced by the settled contentment of a woman well loved and sure of her place. A small girl with her mother's dark hair and her father's pale gray eyes came tearing around the corner of the house, chasing a barn cat, tripped over her own bare feet, and sat down hard in the dirt. She looked at her scraped palms with fierce concentration, decided against tears, and pushed herself back up to continue the chase. "Stubborn as her mother," Silas said, pride plain in his voice. "And slow to give up, same as her father," Clara said, eyes bright with teasing. "Took her the better part of a minute to decide crying wasn't worth the trouble." Silas laughed, low and easy, and slipped his arm around her shoulders, and she leaned into him as they watched their daughter's game run its course in the last of the light. They sat together in the kind of quiet that needs no filling, the air carrying the smell of cut hay and the first hint of rain still a day off. "Do you ever think on that man from the trust?" Silas asked after a while. "Whitmore." "I think on him," Clara said. "He believed a ledger was only ever about numbers. He never understood there was more to count than what he could see." "It's a strange kind of harvest," Silas said. "The hard years and the lean ones, and whatever hope a person plants anyway." "And 14 calves nobody wanted?" Clara added, a smile in her voice. "And 14 calves nobody wanted," he agreed, and drew her closer against him, thinking of the woman he had found half-starved on a dusty road with nothing left to her name but pride, and looking now at the woman beside him, mother of his child, the one who had seen worth in a run-down ranch and a lonely man where there had seemed to be nothing left worth saving, and turned all of it, patiently and without any grand gesture at all, into everything he would ever need. He had been a slow man, by his own admission and hers, but he had gotten there in time, and some nights, watching the sun go down gold over land that was finally, truly his and hers together, that seemed to him the only thing in this life that had ever really mattered.